You know what you're getting into. There is nothing wrong with your internet. This is Thought on Tap, your monthly news, views, and brews brought to you by the Core Humanities program in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Nevada, Reno. My name is Carlos Mariscal. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and co-creator of Thought on Tap. We are also available on YouTube on our channel, thoughtontap.com/channel, or today's episode, thoughtontap.com/YouTube. So tonight, we're going to spend the first 30 minutes in a discussion about a topic, rethinking our tech overlords with our panelists. At around 6:10, we're going to open our discussion up to questions from the audience, but you can type them in whenever they occur to you, and we'll get to them in due time. And then we're going to wrap up with our final thoughts. Okay, so before we get to that, I just want to set the stage. This might be, hoping, our final online event for a while. It's also the first of our podcast series. It is perhaps suiting that today we're going to talk about rethinking our tech overlords. So information technology is to our era what factories and big business were to the Industrial Revolution, or agriculture was to the first civilizations. And like any big change, there's winners and losers, there's opportunities and threats, and there's choices and limitations of those choices. As a brief example, last week, Facebook was offline for 6 hours. And in those 6 hours, it affected 3 billion users, including eliminating WhatsApp use for the majority of the world, which some countries rely on that as their primary form of communication. That same week, there was a whistleblower that revealed that Facebook had been aware of the body dysmorphia that Instagram was causing in young women, and it finally acted on an 8-month tip that users had illegally sold portions of the Amazon rainforest. That's a week of events and news, and I think it illustrates how our lives have become hopelessly entangled with technology and those who make and control it. It's not all bad. There's some good to it. We're more connected than ever. We have more access to goods and to information than any other people in history. There's new technologies that allow us to live better, longer, richer lives. But we're also more divided than ever. And we, both in terms of who has access to technology and what we think about the other. Their jobs have been automated and reduced and exported, exacerbating income inequality and leading to worker exploitation abroad. There's also an increased risk of digital attacks, including recent ransomware attacks to companies, essential infrastructure like hospitals or power plants, and even simple citizens. And then there's other things that just change the structure of society. Amazon, for example, is responsible for 50% of online orders on average, and has restructured the way we get goods and even the way we organize cities. Relatedly, the supply chains that we've come to rely on have become so intricate that a microchip shortage has led to a skyrocketing in price of used cars, even used cars. This recent example of COVID shows that people in information-based jobs like us here can stay at home in situations where it's dangerous to go to work. But people who have essential jobs, the so-called essential workers, have to pick up the burden for the rest of us. So with that, we want to explore these questions tonight. And as always with Thought on Tap, it's not just one person guiding us through it. We have a panel to help guide our thoughts about the issues at stake. So let's meet them tonight in alphabetical order. Chris Church is a cultural and digital historian who specializes in disasters, nationalism, and social movements. He's also affiliated with the UNR Cybersecurity Center and is currently working on a book, Hacking Society, Vigilantes, Outcasts, and Miscreants from the High Seas to Cyberspace, which explores those left behind by the growth of modern globalized capitalism. Hey, Chris.
Hello, nice to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Dave Feil-Seifer is an associate professor of computer science and engineering, also at UNR. He works on socially assisted robotics, especially in the realm of healthcare and personalized caregiving. His work on this socially relevant topic connects the topics in machine learning, human-robot interaction, and their associated ethical issues. He has dozens of grants and journal articles on these topics. Hey, Dave.
Hey.
And finally, Daisy Hollman is a computer engineer at Google, formerly of Sandia National Laboratories. She also has a PhD in theoretical chemistry and has published dozens of academic papers across a range of topics. At Google and throughout her career, she has been an advocate of increasing diversity in programming and making it accessible to everybody. Hey, Daisy.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Of course, thank you for being here. So I think I'd like to start with Chris. I mentioned that you're interested in those left behind by capitalism. And so as the relentless force of market continues exporting, automating, and gigifying jobs, is there any insight from history about how we might best respond to it or worst respond to it?
I think I'll take you up on the second half of that, just because historians and we disaster historians tend to focus on when things go wrong. And there's definitely the worst way to respond to it. To give you one example, is naval demobilization after the War of Spanish Succession. Within the space of a single year, basically about 50,000 sailors dropped down to about 13,000. So you had about 36,000 sailors who lost their jobs within the span of the year. Pretty much at almost exactly that moment, piracy took off and threatened basically all of maritime trade across the Atlantic. And so that's the wrong way to handle it, to ignore the problem and just allow, really to allow economic insecurity among the vulnerable to fester, especially people with skills in the early modern period, skills with ships, which was so vital to modern trade. And you could see parallels today with skills in the tech and computer industries with potential massive layoffs. And I'll just kind of end my response with a quote from Obi Sise, who is a researcher at the Institute for Global Studies, who says that if you don't share your stability and economic success with the poor will share their instability and poverty with you.
Yeah, fair enough. That is those are words to worry about. Maybe I should throw this to Dave. So you're the resident roboticist in the panel, and related to this discussion, I feel like robots have increased automation and increased our reliance on them. When you look back historically at the 1800s, people thought as soon as jobs get automated, all of society was going to benefit. We were going to work at most maybe 12 hours a week. Everything was going to be idyllic. And that didn't happen, obviously. So do you think that was naive? And do you think that it's possible that current robotics is going to benefit the public at large in the way that people thought back in the 1800s, rather than the individuals that can simply afford robots?
So it's a really interesting question. And to answer, you got to look at a couple of different things. One of the factors that you want to consider here is economics, which thinks about worker productivity in terms of efficiency, how many widgets per hour a worker can make. And as that has gotten bigger, the owners of those factories, the makers of those widgets, haven't said, oh, you've done your yearly quota, I'm going to pay you the same amount of money, now you can go home for 8 months. They've said, now you can make 3 times as many widgets in a year. Good, now that's the new baseline. And so the goalposts for work have moved. And as automation has increased, that's been a continual theme. We haven't, with the advent of air conditioning, which allowed places to be open in the summer, which caused great efficiency gains. It allowed for things to be used for factories to be open for much longer. We didn't just say, oh, the factories can be open. We said they can, we didn't say that, oh, you can work half the time. We said, no, you have to do twice the amount of work now.
My God, I thought that air conditioning was the one good benefit of modern society, that and indoor plumbing. so
indoor plumbing is a universal good. Air conditioning has a bit of a mixed bag. Awesome.
So thinking in terms of, we were talking in terms of automation of big factories, robots. I want to maybe bring Daisy in on this discussion where So it seems like in robotics, the impact, like we can see the impact of air conditioning. It's immediately obvious and apparent, right, when you succeed or fail, or at least perhaps more so. On the other hand, when you deal with software, it's a little bit more invisible to the eyes of the people that are using that particular software. And so, in the worst case scenario, you can imagine this leading to radicalizing users or perhaps other things. So I guess the question is, how do programmers' decisions impact our experience with software? And what do you think, if anything, users can do to gain control of the world that we're in?
So I think this is a really interesting question in the context of big tech, especially. I think it's a very different question in the context of startup tech or in the context of smaller operations. I think in big tech, we really need to step back and say, hey, programmers shouldn't be making decisions that impact the public in that way. We should have ethicists. We should have people employed by big software companies to look at the implications of the software, to look at the implications of the design. Google has a position called a privacy engineer that does this. And they're literally they're not programmers often. They look at the final product, they look at the design along the way and look at the implications of the design for privacy of the end user. I think that in the context of big tech, it makes a lot more sense to have more of that and really control what kinds of decisions software engineers are allowed to make in that context. I think in smaller tech, it's really hard. I think we need more liberal arts educated computer programmers, and I don't have an answer for how to do that, but because when you can't afford to have an ethics panel review every app you put out, maybe there needs to be regulation on that. I don't know.
And that actually, I think, as a philosopher, I completely sympathize and accept that. So maybe actually I could get first Dave's and then Chris's thoughts on these issues. So I know, Dave, you've done a little bit of work on ethical issues in robotics. And I guess I'm curious as to what ethical problems always tend to come up, and are there any particularly thorny issues in that ethical situation that you're involved in?
So there are some that are kind of obvious. What if the robot hurts someone? I think a lot of the, if you think about autonomous cars as an example, there's a lot of discussion of things like the trolley problem, which kind of is absurd. If you're trying to decide between which two people you can kill, you're already in a bad way. But I think there's some notion about the ethics of harm, which to me is kind of an easy one. Don't. But there's also there's ethics surrounding the role of the robot and the use of the robot. And so some of the stuff that I've written in sort of ethical appraisals of socially assisted robotics is, let's say, for example, you're using a robot in a care setting, and that is doing the task that a person would normally do. That might be a net good for the patient in that it increases the number of minutes that they are being cared for, right? It might also make healthcare cheaper and attainable for a wider number of people. But let's say that is also reducing human contact, social contact, because now parts of their healthcare tasks are being automated. Well, now that social interaction might be something that is also necessary for the health of the patient. And so if you're reducing human contact and that is causing a bigger harm socially than the added benefit of whatever healthcare is, you might be creating a bigger risk or harm than benefit. And so that's a potential ethical issue that might be a little less obvious. There's also the thinking around the nature of work and the replacement of work. And so if you are using a robot to directly replace a person's job, and that makes things cheaper, but it causes an entire industry to suddenly be unemployed, that might not be a net benefit for humanity. It might be really good for the dollar signs at the end of a CEO's equation, but it might not be something that benefits all of us. And so one of the questions we have to ask if we're thinking about things in an ethical fashion is the relationship between the harms that a robot or the taking a person out of a task is doing and the good. And so it moves beyond just don't hurt people. It also gets to how can robots best be used to help people, and computers as well.
And paying attention to stakeholders who's involved, all of the. So I actually, Chris, I'm reminded of the last time that you were on Thought on Tap 2 years ago or something. You mentioned two particular projects on lynching, one by EJI and the other by the Tuskegee Institute. One of them centralized human experience and the others rendered it as a mere statistic. So sort of on Dave's point about taking the human out, I guess the question is, what are the risks to each approach? And is there anything that we can learn from history about what happens when you take humans out?
Yeah, I mean, listening to Dave speak about the risk of replacing humans with robots and the ethical concerns there makes me immediately think of what about treating humans as if they're automatons? And what happens over the last 200 years or so is this, as Dave mentioned earlier, this fascination with efficiency from kind of Taylorism in the 19th century all the way up through the present day, this idea that human beings are just kind of either cogs in a wheel, if you're going to believe, say, Charlie Chaplin, in modern times, getting sucked literally into a machine and spit back out the other side. Or as we've seen in the last decade and a half, really that the kind of cutting shifts to these kind of skeleton shifts and this idea of that we need to trim the fat. And I see this incredibly dangerous from an ethical standpoint, but the disaster scholar in me is also terrified by this because it leaves no room for redundancies. And so this became a huge issue at the beginning of the pandemic, right? That if you call in sick, your employer is going to say, we have no one to replace you. There is no one else who is scheduled to work that day come in sick. And that basically then you start to see that system break down. We're seeing that happen right now with logistics and trade. Things were pushed to be so hyper optimized and efficient that all it takes is a few missed points and then the system becomes backed up. And so there's a real overlap between the ethical concerns of making sure that you're maintaining the human aspect of thing and not treating people as objects with the actual, like, how sustainable and how long can the system go before it just simply breaks down. And I think kind of keeping both of those in focus are important because I hesitate to say, but I don't think that the ethical argument always tracks with those in people in power, perhaps speaking more a language of, although, you know, there are ethical losses there if you speak a language of maintaining an actual sustainable system, but there you have it.
Right, maybe, Daisy, maybe we can bring you in here. It seems like we're talking about, so on the one hand, the ethical issue, right? There's always people that are left out, even when we're talking about defending humans, right? We leave out certain classes of individuals in our society. And so I was wondering if you could speak to that on the one hand, and on the other hand, to Chris's point about relying on perhaps more of an instrumental reason. Like, is there an instrumental reason why we should try to be more inclusive and incorporating? So both the ethical and the instrumental.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting issue to talk about. There's always the so I work on designing programming languages as my part of my day job, and there's always the analogy to the written word and how, as language was designed and developed by written language was designed and developed predominantly by men. We saw mostly men doing the writing for a long time, and someone who has a much stronger background in history can correct me on that. But I think that we kind of see the same thing happening with programming languages and with programming ecosystems and software ecosystems, where and it's difficult to give specific examples, because when you start trying to give specific examples of this, it kind of gets it gets a little cheesy. You can come up with like, oh, this group of 10 men who developed this one app forgot that half of the population has periods. Ha 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 ha. But like that's like that's missing the point, right? It's like the real cost is these kind of micro taxes that build up over time from code that it's written by men and reviewed by men, or written by white people and reviewed by white people in ways that white people communicate with each other, or in ways that men communicate with each other. And then when you are a Black woman trying to get involved in that project, you are paying this tax of reading this code that wasn't really written for someone with your background to understand. And it's very difficult to cite very specific examples of this. And it's very difficult to prove, right? And so but we know this is an effect in written language. We know this is an effect in general, in spoken language also. And so representation matters quite a bit there. And I think that, that creating more thinking jobs, moving more towards lots more thinking jobs, is going to lead to a need for people of various backgrounds to break into these things. I genuinely think we should be teaching programming in elementary school. I think that this is programming is the writing of the future. And I don't know, I've gone way over my time and gone way far afield from the original question here, but yeah, I think, it's we are so far from knowing what the tax is of historical racism on programming languages, because we just don't have. In the year 2019, I looked up the statistics for this in preparation. In the year 2019, there were 13 PhDs in the US awarded in CS to Black people, 3 to Black women. Yeah, that's mind-blowing. We have an enormous problem with diversity in computer science, in academic computer science in particular, and in particular in the high-powered jobs. So we don't even really know the impact on race. We're just starting to know the impact on gender. We're getting 20% or so of CS PhDs are now women, and that's just in the past 10 years. And we're starting to see that their participation in large and complex code bases falls off as they move up the career ladder. It effectively hits a glass ceiling. So I don't know, there's probably a lot of things to talk about there in terms that I'm very passionate about and could talk about forever. So I'll pass over.
Yeah, maybe I'll bring Dave into this. I'm reminded of the situation where it turned out that a hand reader, like a soap dispenser, couldn't read dark-skinned hands, or the situation where Amazon attempted to automate its recruiting profile, and it ended up just exacerbating all of the implicit biases that previously successful applications had. Or at the extreme, when Microsoft produced the Twitter robot that became a Nazi within like 24 hours. And so in those situations, it kind of worries me that the programmers' biases or particular blind spots might in some way impact the software. So Dave, you teach algorithms, and I guess the question is, do you think there's any hope for AI impartiality? Do you think? Yeah.
All right. Well, let me pop up a couple of levels. So first off, I'm talking to humanitarians and people in the humanities, so I can recommend a book and not just a tweet, and people will read it. And if you haven't read Algorithms of Oppression by Sophia Noble, she just was awarded a MacArthur Foundation award. They don't actually like to call it the Genius Grant, I guess, but certified genius, whatever. And it is a fantastic work detailing some of what the problem that I'm going to call garbage in, garbage out. And it's an industry term, garbage in, garbage out. And the notion of there is a sort of fallacy in the software world that an algorithm is impartial. And there's a lot of reasons that that is not true. But the first way that is not true, and the first way that bias can be introduced into a theoretically impartial algorithm, is looking at the training data. And so take Google search, for example. Google search was trained on, has learned from people's usage of the internet over time. It's looked at, it spiders through all of the available web pages, but it also used the activity of people that adopted the internet first. And the first people that were adopting the internet were traditionally white men. And by the way, this isn't limited to Google search. This is also search engines in general. It learns from prior usage of behavior. And so if the early adopters of the internet are primarily white men of a particular age, it's going to learn and recommend like a white man of a particular age. Similarly, if I'm going to circle back and now dunk on Amazon, Amazon's algorithm for evaluating applications was trained in part on hiring and promotion decisions made at Amazon in the past, where a lot of the people in charge who were making those hiring and promotion decisions were white men. So even though it wasn't explicitly programmed to be discriminatory against women or to discriminate against Black appearing names, it learned those biases implicitly from the biases of the people working at Amazon. And so this is something that is requires us to do a couple of steps. The first thing we have to do is acknowledge our biases. And that is something that I think we have been doing in the past couple of years in society, have been working on acknowledging our biases and trying to talk about bias and the role that bias plays in the world. And that is an important part of this process. The second thing we have to do is not just examine the algorithm, although there are companies like Facebook that won't even let us audit the algorithm, but we also have to look at the training data. You brought up Microsoft's, I always get the name wrong, it's Tay, something like that. It's Twitter bot that became horrifying inside of a day.
Tay tweet.
Yes, yeah. You're right. And what happened there wasn't that the algorithm that defined it was biased. What happened was the internet doesn't allow us to have nice things very often. And so people got involved and started training it to act in that way and rewarding it explicitly for behaving in that way. And that's why it became horrifying. And it only took a day. And so one of the things that happens here is a seemingly impartial algorithm, if learning from biased data, will become biased and will learn those biases. And so that's an important part of this. And so Algorithms of Oppression by Sophia Noble, and I highly recommend reading it. It gets into a bunch of different things and a bunch of different algorithms that can be used that are seemingly impartial. And then the effect of that, the end effect of it, is actually quite biased.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I have a question for Dave. So in your department, I know that several CS Ed departments, at the very least, have started looking very carefully at requiring ethics courses or requiring things like that in their curriculum. Nobody really thinks twice about, say, telling a journalist that they need to take an ethics course, but for some reason, it's kind of radical that a computer science major should have to take ethics as part of their curriculum. What are your thoughts on that? And has UNR moved in that direction at all?
UNR as an organization, I can't speak for. My own teaching has been informed by ethics throughout. And in my last, I taught AI. I'm not teaching it this semester, but I taught it fall of last year. And when I taught it that semester, what I tried to do was introduce some of the ways that seemingly impartial algorithms can become biased, or even just the way that data in the real world is very different from data that might come out of an idealized system that lives entirely in a computer. And one of the things I like to say, my research area is human-robot interaction, and I like to say that computers are difficult. The real world is a noisy system on top of that. And then humans are an even noisier system on top of that. And so that compounds a bunch of challenges. And so as you're having a computer that deals with people in the real world, we are going to have these noisy moments, and that's going to be really challenging. And so I try to teach those noisy moments in my artificial intelligence class. I don't think it lives in a single class. I think it lives throughout the curriculum in an ideal fashion. And I think students should be presented with thought experiments on this continually. I think it should happen on day one in CS1, and I think it should happen on the last day of senior projects. And I think it should be sprinkled throughout, where similar to the way that philosophers and ethicists are forced to confront challenging problems and think about it, we should be, and computer scientists are supposed to be trained in solving problems. We should be trained to examine these situations, not just from a code standpoint, but also from a societal standpoint.
Chris, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, if I could jump in, I think one of the key problems that is baked into not just our curriculum, but just widely in society is this over-reliance on a false dichotomy between subjective and objective in terms of numbers don't lie, right? Statistics don't not lie. They are somehow inherently factual. And this is itself a product of the late modern era, the post-industrial society, the move toward, say, censuses in the mid-1800s. And that problem I was mentioning earlier of kind of translating people into numbers, dehumanizing them, and somehow seeing them as no longer subjects but objects. And you can see this in when we build these technologies that we then use and then pretend collectively that the results of what they produce somehow objectively confirms the thing we thought we knew when we built the system, right? So a good example of this, you had mentioned the hand readers for soap. And there's a long history to why hand readers are really terrible at reading dark skin complexions. And it goes back to early film being developed specifically to pick up the contrast and white balance of light skin complexions against a darker background. And in fact, it never even got addressed until going back to instrumental kind of things, until furniture manufacturers started complaining because early film could not pick up the darker wood tones that were being published in catalogs. And so that's when you actually start seeing a push at all to be able to pick up darker complexions in film.
And that
so
push,
this
by
is,
the way, was continued and really brought home by Oprah Winfrey in the 80s, wanting darker skinned people to appear as they are on her TV show. And she's actually responsible for going to some of the makers of film to make that process show dark skin better.
Yeah, and I think what I had read too is that shows like Empire were some of the first shows to specifically hire cinematographers who were well versed in balancing those skin tones so that people of darker complexions looked as they should on camera, looked as people of lighter skin tones had all the tools kind of in their favor. And it's easy to then read that as somehow an objective truth, but it was created by people who were privileging one group against another marginalized group. And so to go back to the issue of curriculum, when I teach my digital humanities classes, the first thing I do is say, let's jettison the idea that data is somehow objective, that it somehow exists in a vacuum and we can trust it as is. And instead look at the whole data life cycle. How was the data collected? Who collected the data? What was the bias of the people who collected the data? All the way up through to the point where it's finally tabulated. Now what conclusions can we draw? And this is something that folks in the social sciences have been doing forever. This is something that folks in the sciences have been doing throughout the 20th century about, well, how do we even know if we can trust the things that we've seen in our experiments to be true? And where do we kind of draw the line between deductive and inductive understandings of the world? Just to give you kind of one example of a funny political cartoon that I saw recently on this was it was a graph that said the number of people who enjoy responding to surveys and obviously this is self-selection bias, it was 100% of people enjoy responding to surveys, because obviously the only people who responded to the survey are those who want to. And this happens across the board in terms of how data gets collected. And once it gets that veneer of being objective, that's where the truthfully, the really dangerous things can happen.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of standpoint theory, right? Where one of the big innovations in the back half of the 20th century was the realization that any attempt to appeal to objectivity or even impartiality just dominates the majority. It represents the majority perspective, the dominating perspective. And so in those appeals to try to like move to true objectivity, you're actually squashing some of the marginalized voices, which, I mean, given, as a philosopher of science, so Chris also said a thing about how there's a variety of different interpretations that people can, given the exact same data, come to an infinite number of different interpretations. That is certainly true. That is one of those features of philosophy of science that's particularly thorny, where we have to like wrap our head around about why we make the choices that we do. So before we go to the audience questions, I thought I'd maybe ask one big broad question and throw it out there to see which of you want to tackle it. Last time I hosted, Francoise Baylis argued for this move for slow science. She's working on biotech genetic modification issues. And the argument is that when we move fast and break things, as they say, we break things. And some of those things can be really hard to put back together after you've broken them. We can completely restructure society and make it so that, your uncle's always sharing like QAnon memes or whatever. So do you think that there should be sort of does anybody, I'll toss this out to everybody, think that there should be an analogous sort of slow technology movement to try to take a step back?
I mean, I'm willing to answer every question, so I'll jump into this one a little bit. First off, I'm a little ticked because I wanted to use the move fast and break things quote so I could dunk on Facebook in addition to Google and Amazon a little bit, but I'll live through it. In terms of slow science, I think acting with deliberation and considering putting more than just the dollar sign at the end of an equation is absolutely crucial. One of the projects I'm working on in my lab is socially aware navigation. And the idea there is you want to get from point A to point B. Well, the most efficient way to get there often gets really close to people, invades personal space, can cause problems, can break up groups. And what we're working on in the lab is understanding models of social appropriateness, using that and putting that into the equation in addition to efficiency. And then what comes out of that is emergent behavior that respects social boundaries. We're intentionally trading off some time to get from point A to point B in exchange for not bothering people and not ticking people off, not breaking up groups, and generally speaking, not invading people's space. So yeah, I think we have to slow things down. I think we have to trade off a little bit of efficiency. Maybe we give people we allow people 30 seconds to wash their hands on a break so that we're making sure that things are, that they have the time to wash their hands properly. Maybe we allow people to rest when they've been hurt. Maybe we allow people to, as Chris was talking about, stay home when they're sick. And that can be really important. But when it comes to technology, maybe releasing things as fast as absolutely possible isn't the answer. Maybe we want to start thinking about doing more testing, making sure that our data sets are varied enough that they're maybe not free of bias, that we better understand the biases of the system, and that moving fast and breaking things will result in broken things. And so, yeah, that's my answer there.
I would definitely like to say that move fast and break things is definitely not something we do at Google. And it's something that we laugh at. And I think a lot of people in the industry who've been in the industry for a while very much knew this was coming on Facebook this past a couple weeks, and we kind of just, it was a matter of when. I mean, I never would have worked for Facebook. I never would work for Amazon. I had to be convinced that Google was doing the right thing, at least in the part of Google that I work for, in order to work there. And I work with a lot of people who had the same attitude coming into Google, that they really had to be convinced that we were trying to do the right thing. So I don't know. I mean, the move fast and break things comment. Yeah, I do think slowing down things to do ethical reviews, do inclusivity reviews, do accessibility reviews, all of those things are required for any product launch at Google. And our teams that do those reviews are very much not programmers. They're people trained in the subject areas that do those things. But I also think that there is harm to be done when technology that can do a lot of good is intentionally slowed down. So I think, there has to be some balance there. But I think it definitely has to not be profit motivated. I think that's where it all starts.
I want to just revise and extend that a little bit and throw a little bit of responsibility toward the humanitarians. There are a lot of people here who are in the humanities, which means some of you may be applying to law school, which means some of you may then run for Congress. Please, please, please take a programming course or a technology course or a physics course or something to understand science. One of the things, if you watch congressional hearings, is how laughable it is that the people we elect to represent us, how their understanding of technology, how ridiculous it is. Some of them probably believes that they're little elves inside of the computer that run everything. And we need to elect people who have training in sciences.
Chris, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, to riff again on the move fast and break things, that what's dangerous about that is that there are people who stand to profit immensely by moving fast and breaking things, but it is a minority of people. And it is people who come from traditional positions of power over the last 500 years. And this is true whether you're talking about technology and displacing folks. I mean, it's not insignificant, right, that Bezos and Zuckerberg are two of the wealthiest people on the planet. But it's also connected to there's a very close linkage to natural disasters and events that cause destruction, because those companies that then quickly move in to rebuild end up reaping vast amount of profits on the back of human suffering. So I think if what we mean by slow science, or perhaps slow society, is to slow down and think about the broader implications beyond just, allowing a very minute number of people to steer the ship for their own profits, but thinking about how does this change affect the wider society, and as a disaster scholar might say, how do we then mitigate those consequences? This isn't to say to eliminate it. So, right, if we get rid of, say, move from coal to renewable energy, it's going to displace people in the job market. But the idea is, how do we mitigate the consequences of that? How do we prevent that from causing harm to those people? It doesn't mean, or not prevent, but how do we lessen the amount of harm caused to those people, perhaps in a kind of utilitarian way for the greater good of everyone else? And so I would support that idea of slow technology. I don't know that, we're all living through the COVID pandemic. I don't know if I wanted everyone to pump the brakes on developing a vaccine, if that's not what I would support in terms of slowing things down. Although thinking about whether or not that vaccine, the technologies behind it, should be shared broadly so that people in the developing world can have access to life-saving preventative medicine, I think that is something that would fall under that umbrella.
Well, to follow along with your vaccine analogy, though, I mean, there are systems put in place to ensure that the vaccines are safe, they're tested, and also effective. And those systems are really important to the trust that we put in the vaccines. And the fact that that has been undermined for various reasons has created great societal problems. And so the notion of safety and ethical review is really crucial, and trust in that review is really crucial. One of the things that the Federal Trade Commission is being tasked with is ensuring that the apps that we give our data to, the companies that we give our data to, are acting in our best interests and holding our data safe. And I think that's really important, to have places that can regulate along those lines and can investigate and can ensure, can give us some sort of safety and assurance that the companies we're entrusting with our data are using them responsibly.
But I mean, to your point, when we made those regulations on vaccines and on how we did not maybe carefully enough make them in the context of potentially developing a vaccine when thousands of people a day are dying, right? That was not a driving factor. We were assuming vaccines were going to be developed over the course of many years. And so, I mean, I think when we develop these regulations, we have to think about the potential cost of human life in worst case scenarios before establishing something that could potentially lose trust, like circumventing certain traditional regulations as done in this case, right? I think there's fault to be had there in both sides.
But we also, I mean, we're kind of living in a society where it's a relay race, but only the last person who touches the baton gets any credit. So even in the case of, say, mRNA vaccines, it's based on decades of basic science research that had, much of which had no profit connections to profit seeking. And it's only that last person who picks up the baton and runs to the finish line to turn it into a marketable product that, in this case, can exert not just fiscal control over it, but also lends it this sense of rapidity that it doesn't necessarily have. And this is true in any technological sector.
So let me we should turn to the audience Q&A, and it actually ties directly into this discussion. By the way, people should feel free to type in their questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll get to them. So there's a comment from Greta de Jong, and it's related, I think, to the question by Isabella Gavaldon, that, well, first, UNR students are required to take ethics courses. It's a requirement in the core curriculum, which I think is a good point, and perhaps we should incorporate it more in other classes. And now to the question, which is related, I think, about whether there's an IRB, an institutional review board for technology. Does anybody have any answers there?
I pulled up ours. Google, I look at some of our internal stuff, and I have to be careful about what I say externally, but I can tell you that our CEO, Sundar Pichai, wrote a opinion piece on this in the Financial Times, I believe. I'll have to look for it. But also, if you go to ai.google/responsibilities, that lists out all of the things that we do. There's a set of things that we list that we will just never do with AI. Nothing related to AI at Google is ever allowed to be used to develop weapons, for instance. At least within Google. I mean, we have to think very carefully about how things are used outside of Google too. And I'm not skirting the blame for things that have happened in the past. But I think that certainly from everything I've seen internally, we take a very, very strong stance on this. And I don't want to sound like a Google apologist. I am a little bit drinking the Kool-Aid, but I do think that there is some contrast in big tech. Several other big tech companies that will remain nameless have not taken this responsibility nearly as seriously as we have. And I think that it's an example of how this can be done right. I'm not saying that necessarily big tech is necessarily a good thing as a whole, but I think there are examples of how it can be done right.
So I think similar to the way that devices are, if a device is considered a medical device, the FDA regulates it to make sure that it's safe and effective. And that regulation comes with extensive review and product testing. There's a requirement like you have for automobiles that things be recalled if there's a problem, that people are informed if there are issues and lot numbers are tracked and things like that. We don't have a similar sort of audit process, nor necessarily should we, for just algorithms that are out in the world. But we do need to think about things like financial records, health records, student records, and how the data from are handled by those algorithms. Now, we do have laws like HIPAA and FERPA, which protect certain types of data, but it is not necessarily enforced as clearly as medical devices are enforced. And some of this stuff is very self-reported. And one of the things that we have to do as a society is demand that, for example, if something's handling our financial data, that we understand how that's happening. We understand where it's going. And the CFPB, this Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, has put a lot of informational content out there and a little bit of opt-in and opt-out. For example, if a credit card company wants to share your data, they have to do some level of informing you that that's happening. But it's not necessarily as complete as it could be.
So, Chris?
Oh, I was going to say, I think one of the important things to do as we're considering the ethics and regulating things is like I said before, jettison that division between subjective and objective, or between hard and soft. I mean, we see this issue widely in society where physical health is given primacy over mental health. One is considered real and tangible, and I can point to your blood pressure, and one is ethereal and subjective. And to give an example from science fiction, in Gibson's Neuromancer, a whole subplot of that is literally just driving a corporate CEO mad by slowly changing his brain chemistry and what he thinks and feels, in order to usurp, really basically have a corporate coup. And I mean, we're in some ways living in a reality that's like that, with the dysmorphia on Instagram and the way in which people's way of seeing the world is so profoundly shaped by the technologies that they interact with. And as Dave was talking about with finances, if someone literally goes into your bank account, hacks in and steals $10,000, that's in that realm of kind of hard, objective truth, capital T truth. But if you're absolutely inundated with gambling advertisements everywhere you go, and they convince you to go gamble $10,000 with the full knowledge that you are not statistically going to ever win, especially if you play at that game long enough. Those are considered, one is okay because it's got a softness to it, and one is not okay. And I think if we're going to consider the ethics, we need to give far more equal weight, like we do than we do currently in society, between kind of hard and soft consequences.
I think that directly ties into this question by Erica Dietlein about the solutions that we've proffered here being about hiring people who study stuff or studying stuff. But at the level of the people that are negatively affected by some of the decisions of tech companies, they don't have the opportunity or time or training to study these things. And so it seems like the people at the end of all of these platforms end up being given advice that they can't really act on. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I would just echo what Dave said earlier. I mean, it's incumbent on people in the quote unquote hard sciences to step over into the quote unquote soft sciences just as much as it is for people, say, in the humanities, to become well-versed in technology, programming, and become scientifically literate. I mean, I think that we are living in the fallout from a 19th century academic division between, the loss of the natural philosopher. And Carlos, I'm sure you could speak way more than I could, far more eloquently than I could about this. But that division between, like, that segmenting off of knowledge, and our students live it all the time. I can't tell you how many students in my digital humanities classes are just loath to even look at anything mathematic, and are terrified of any sort of technological tool we might use in the classroom. And a lot of it's overcoming that. And I think it goes both ways. We need to break down that division between the two.
But I don't think that's actually what Eric is talking about here. I think mostly what Eric is talking about here is that people who are most adversely affected by technology have high school educations. And how do we actually get their concerns, or differently from that, on a global scale, are people in underrepresented nations that are affected by globalization? And I think on a global scale, I think that in general, the best answer I can come up with to that is that the people who do get those jobs sure better take their responsibility seriously. I mean, I don't have a solution for how to equalize education across all of humanity. I think that working towards that goal is excellent, but I think that in the meantime, the people who have been trusted with the responsibility of ethics for big companies had better take that responsibility seriously, and they better take into account the needs of people that are uneducated and maybe aren't having the opportunity to voice their concerns. And she says we can always fire ethicists if we don't like them. That's also true, but there's some oversight to that, hopefully. If companies are a little bit more public about their ethics process, then there's at least some oversight to that, and there are whistleblowers. But anyway, yeah, I think that the first step towards that is people taking that job very, very seriously and taking in an understanding of what people who don't have a voice need to say about the product.
I'm going to suck up to the humanities people right now and give a humanities answer to this. One way to talk about education to people who, at the high school level, we need to have more speech and debate in high school settings. We need to learn how to break down an argument, how to take a claim and really look at it from a bunch of different facets. I think that made me a good computer scientist. I mean, it made me a power nerd, but it also made me a good computer scientist because I was able to look at a problem from multiple angles. And I think when evaluating the effect of technology on our lives, if more of us had a sort of debate mindset where we had to construct an argument and try to knock it down in our own heads or try to build it up, that would help us out. So that's my humanities answer. The other thing we've got to do is we have to educate people in how computing actually works. I disagree that I think programming should be in elementary schools, but I do think computing should be in elementary schools. I do think the act of problem solving and breaking things down needs to be introduced. One of my side hustles is I'm talking to some early K-12 educators about how to teach English and computing in the same kind of lesson, how to think of sentence construction as a computing problem. And since writing, speaking, and coding are all creative acts, that they use the same muscles, and strengthening them will help all of them together.
This is a wonderful conversation. I think we have time for perhaps one more question. And I kind of want to go back to, so Brianna Lane in the chat asks this question about market reorganization. It goes back to a discussion that Chris was talking about earlier about how something that he said about workers not being fungible, right? Like when an industry leaves a town, it's not immediately obvious how those particular workers will do well, even if somebody else somewhere else will do much better, right? So how do you think we should address some of those issues? And perhaps I'll put Chris on the spot there.
Yeah, thanks, Carlos, for putting me on the spot. I mean, to go back to what I was saying earlier about being a kind of person who studies disasters, right? There's no perfect solution to any of these problems. Right? There's no way to not cause some degree of disruption the question is, are you causing disruption in the name of progress for a wider group of people while trying to help those who are quote unquote left behind? Or are you causing disruption in the name of progress for a much smaller group of people? And I mean, I mentioned briefly piracy, but one of the reasons why piracy became so prevalent by the end of the 1600s was because of the explosion in merchant trade across the Atlantic and the way in which profits were being concentrated in such a narrow slice of the those involved. And so the captain would basically receive all of the profits, and the crew would receive a flat wage and see none of the benefits. And so one of the first things pirates did after throwing their captain overboard was create a much more flat pay structure. So at most, the captain would, on the most extreme end, would receive 6 times what a sailor would earn. More frequently would earn twice what a standard sailor would earn. And then say your quartermaster 1.5 times. And what concerns me very much is we're talking about whether or not the coal industry, for instance, should be disrupted in the name of green energy. But that almost seems like a distraction from the fact that, like, say, CEOs make 330 times what the average employee at that company makes. And so it's like, yeah, we're dealing with a paper cut when we've got a gashing wound. And I don't want to see, a kind of late 17th, early 18th century explosion on our hands, or heaven forbid, a late 19th or late 18th century kind of period of revolutions on our hands.
Yeah, that is a great point, perhaps, to end on. And so I want to thank the Thought on Tap committee, Daniel, Enrique Perez, Simone Gubler, Anushka Perez, Meredith Oda, Vadrika Tian, Callum Ingram, and Stephen Pasqualina. Special thanks to Breton Rodriguez and Program Chair David Rondell for help in this particular event. I also want to thank Deborah Modelmog, Lisa McDonald, Chris Stansel, and our undergraduate student workers. Thanks to our once and future partners, Laughing Planet, Nevada Humanities, the Hollman Project, and K-Wink. I also, in particular, would like to everybody at home to give a round of applause to our fantastic panelists, Stacey Hollman, Chris Church, and Dave Feil-Seifer. But most of all, I want to thank you all for joining us for this and other Thought on Tap events. On behalf of Thought on Tap, I'm Carlos Mariscal. Thank you and good night.